Te u tomua whakatapu mo e ala mai te oku iho taulo tolo tonga, aia okune ao niu ki e tau mea kotoa. Tūlou ki e kere tapu oku tau moui me iai he ahoni. Whakawhetai e tau la mahao o lava ai ke taua usia he ahoni. Tuku ke tala mo ka apui, pia keu whakamalu malu he tala ka kato, oi whanua, moi fuka aku kei viringi a. Pea tawangata i a te kita, kai ata ke whai e tari rerei o ki mautolu he ahoni. Tulou atu ki he ngai whawhonga kotoa o ku tonu ke whakatapua, kai tuku pe mua ke unga he whakatapu muaki o i kai halau hingoa, te ria na aku paki i halau te rie. Pea tamala ai he whakataha angani. Whakatapu mawahe heni ki he mokopuna o tua motu Lisiate Wolfgramm. He whakawhanga mariei ho taimi ka ke kau mai koe whie umataha hono pau tolo aki e ngahi tala mahu inga o e ane awhi ke ouan a ta whia ia he tō tangata o e ahoni. Pea i kai haofo ia he okurea aki e hou hou ai tua koloa. Whakamalo maalunga atu ho ofa whanua mo ofa tofia o maulawe ai he ahoni. Te ulewa he e ku whakahoha a tau atu. Tuku atu ki a koe ririka.
Malo au pito alisi kole ke o hufanga he whakatapu ko osi hona au whaki. Malo lelei, kainga, ko hoku ingoa, ko lilika, whanua funaki, ko ekuwha ko ana vanila tauwha me hateho, maufanga mo halaufuli, pea ko eku tamai, ko kalake whanua junior me homa ha kame mo uiha. Naku tupuhake I Hawaii ka Okuolo Tonga Nofo I Henis Osaka Siapani. Hi everyone. I just want to welcome everyone and thank everyone for coming. And I just wanted to start off with the background of Ofakitonga. This, for those who don't know, this group initially started as an IG group thread where we were learning a Tongan word daily. But then that group extended to a virtual Zoom space, which is this space. It started in May of 2020 during the pandemic. And so it was just a space inviting all who wanted to learn the Tongan language, talk about the language and the culture. We meet weekly to discuss Tongan words, phrases, proverbs. And then earlier this year in February 2021, we had Honorable Frederica Duita was invited as a guest speaker, and she had conveyed to us that her mother, Her Royal Highness Princess Bilalevu herself, wanted to gift the group the name Ofakitonga for all of us in the diaspora to remember the love for our motherland. So we're going to go ahead and drop the links to our Instagram, Discord, Twitter, if you want to stay connected on, updates on when we often meet. But we once a month have, the honor of having a guest speaker come in and from our Tongan community, and we have open question and answer talanoa like today. So we look forward to learning from each other and tauhiva each other. I just wanted to give a little bit of some housekeeping of Zoom etiquette. You're more than welcome to keep your mic or camera on and off. Please feel free to use the chat box. We also encourage you to come as you are. You're not required to stay for the whole session. You can leave or come in whenever you feel free or feel like doing so. We want to also, just as a reminder, to be respectful of each other. We have zero tolerance for language that is related to discrimination, including racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia. That has no place here. So just please be respectful of each other's journeys and also but we do at the same time open-minded, welcome open-mindedness and experiences and perspectives in just taking care of each other in our relationships. So without further ado, I will go ahead and give the time over to Saya.
Malo pito saya. Siya to o pagkainga maulay Ko hoki moa ko ane te pō whiwhita. Ko e kwhae, o se o sa koe tāta e ki ko langi tō tai te pō, o ka hau me ko longa. E ko e kwhae ko la wingi whine te pō, o ka hau me no pakawao. Nā te pake I Wollongong, New South Wales, Australia, ka ko tonga nofo I Melbourne, Australia. Ko le ke hwhanga I ngā tapu ko Osman Alfaki. I'm really excited and really humbled to be in today's session, and particularly because we get to Talanoa with Richard Wolfgramm, who I've been following for a little while now. So I'm just going to give everybody, for the purpose of today, a quick introduction to Lisiate or Richard, and then I'll hand over to him to do his own personalised introduction. So just bear with me a sec. So Richard is the co-founder and administrator at Mana Academy Charter School, where he is currently employed. Previous to that, he was creative director for almost 15 years at a national education company and a residential mortgage company based in Salt Lake City. He's been involved in community work since high school in various capacities and organisations. He used to produce the Tongan language program on KRCL-FM, a local community radio station in Salt Lake City. He's the founder, publisher, editor of the Ano Masima News, and a founder and co-host of the Pacific Eye radio show on Utah FM. Lisiate now exclusively spends most of his time in the service of their school community at Mana Academy. Welcome, Lisiate. It's a privilege and an honour to have you join us today. I'm really looking forward to your insights. And I'll hand over to you shortly to, please, I've left out the part where you've told me your villages and your parents. Please, I would much prefer that you introduce that yourself, and then I'll let you provide some context and a little bit of history in terms of the Toki Ukamea podcast and William Mariner's book, and we can go from there. Malo Alpito.
Malo Alpito, siata ofa, everyone. Some of you I recognize and I've met before in person, and some of you I have not, but siota ofa si famalo at ke motol ko toape homo fiekau he po ke tau lave I podcast ko Toki Ukamea. Alisi, thank you so much for your introduction. I don't think I was deserving of all of that, but thank you anyway. And you made me really emotional when you brought up my grandpa's name. So thank you for that reminder, because my grandpa Tuamotu is really the one who instilled in me the love that I have for, you know, our Tongan legends, Tukuholofonua and things like that. And so, Alisi, I didn't expect that, but thank you so much for that. Alisi, I have met in person, and she has visited our school, and I've always followed the work that she does. Alisi, you are a person that I greatly admire, and thank you for all the work that you do. And then, of course, we have some artists in here that I admire as well. So my dad is, so these are my villages, okay? My dad is from Koloa, Vava'u, and then, and he has a German side. That's where I get the last name Wolfgramm. It has served me very well as far as white passing in this world. And it has gotten me into a lot of doors, but, and that's all I'll say about that. But my father's from, so he has a German side, but his Tongan side is from Koloa in Halaufuli. And so, Lika, I heard you mention Halaufuli, so we're gonna have to compare our family tree. My mother's also from Vava'u. Her family's from Mataika, and then her Mataika side married to Fatai, but then some of that Fatai ancestry has Mataika, so it's kind of like, you know, reciprocating back to the between the two villages, which is so common of our Tongan ancestry. But anyway, I'm very fortunate that I had some time to live in Tonga and actually step foot on these places. And so for me, these places are very real. And I think one of the things in working, especially with our school students, is that it's very hard for them to conceptualize identity and place because they've never been in the places where their ancestors come from. So part of the reason why this podcast was created was to kind of make those connections more tangible for that generation, and even just for like myself. You know, because we all look for ways and we yearn for ways to connect to printed materials and things like that, where we normally, our histories have been left out. And so I'm just very grateful for this opportunity to talk about the podcast, and especially to see how your little group has grown, because I remember when you first started, and now look at all the work you've done so far. So thank you for having me.
Lisiate, I was really excited because I remember when you first announced on Instagram that you were going to talk about William Mariner's book, and it was called Toki Ukamea. It was right at the beginning of, I think, when the pandemic was sort of unfolding, like last year. And I had read William Mariner's book like years and years and years ago, but I didn't really understand it. And so I was a little bit, and I had all my own, like I was quite skeptical of the book anyway because of who it was written by, but I was really interested in and more intrigued that there was actually a Tongan that was going to come in and then narrate the book. So that for me was probably the most exciting part, because I knew that somebody was going to be able to come in and contextualize a lot of the book in a way that I wasn't able to connect with it earlier. I'm not sure if there are others within the group that have felt the same way. So I just wanted to ask Richard, what was your intention behind starting with William Mariner's book, and recognizing too that, you know, like, because I'm also quite intentional about what I read now in terms of who it's written by, if it's got to do with our histories. So just are you able to just talk us through your thoughts around William Mariner's book and how it brought you to that point of doing the podcast?
Yeah, sure. I have always loved the book, and I read the first edition where it's written and all the Tongan words are written phonetically, and so they're not written in, like, you know, our proper Tongan language, and so that really turned me off. Okay, and I after I read the book, I was like, I don't care to revisit this book anymore. Because it was really hard to access because of all of that. Yeah, and there's so much of it in the book. And so it wasn't until this gentleman named Paul Dale rewrote the book, and he wrote, so that's the one I use mostly in when I am preparing for the podcast, is I usually reference that book more. And he also makes some corrections to some of Mariner's observations about Tongan culture, just because his book is more recent, and so, you know, of course, he has access to more recent information. But during that time, I think I encountered the book in the very first Tongan History Association conference that came here to Utah, and that was like a long time ago, probably before most of you were born. I think it was like 1990 something. So now I'm really dating myself. But at the time, I was still, I had graduated from high school and was going to university. And so at that conference, they talked about it a lot. And Dr. Mahina came from New Zealand, and he brought his little army of warriors, and they were just so awesome. I was so inspired by his students. And there were Palangi presenters there, and the students that came from New Zealand were just like totally just, questioning their research and things like that. So that to me, I felt was very empowering. And so I wanted to look, growing up in Vava'u, I was kind of familiar with Mariner's story and in some of the locations where the story takes place. And so my grandmother from Mataika and Feletoa, for those of you who are not familiar with the geography of Vava'u, there are villages that are right next to each other. Okay, and then there's like a little gap in between. But the gap in between, there are some remnants of the fort that used to be there that we talk about in the podcast. Some of the langis are in Mataika and some of it are in Feletoa. And as a matter of fact, Benjamin Work, who's in this call, he sent me some pictures of when he was there, and I shared those pictures in on the podcast IG page. And so there was a part, my grandmother's sister lived in Feletoa, and so we were always going in between the two villages, but we were always told to stay away from a certain area because that's where, and was never explained why. And it wasn't until I was older that I learned that this is where the fort used to stand. And so Mataika and Feletoa, the people there would always say that area is haunted because of ancient spirits that lived, that occupied that space. And so now that we've, read about that history, it totally makes sense that if there are spirits there, if you believe in that, those kind of things, I do, and I'm not scared of them at all. That makes sense to me that, of course, there would be something there, right? Whether it's artifacts from those times or even just spirits they're wandering. And so I knew that in the back of my head, but then to find out there was a book written about it and that Mariner actually documented his experience in Tonga. And so I knew I had to get a hold of this book, and I actually bought the book in Tonga during one of my trips there because you could never find it here. But now that I see there are reprints that you can buy on Amazon, and I've actually bought it for friends on Amazon. So for anyone that's interested in buying that book, the book's not called Toki Ukamea. So if you use that name to look it up, you won't find it. I believe it's an account of Tongan natives. I believe that's the official Mariner title of the book. And he also co-authored it with someone by the last name of Martin. Now, the other book I referenced, Paul Dale. Let me just pull up my iBook while I'm talking, because that's where I found this book, and it's called the Tonga Book, 4th edition. So if you just go to, I found it on iBook. So there is a digital copy of that, and that is more updated. And then, all the Tongan words are written out correctly so that you don't have to, it takes out the guesswork in it. So, so that's really where my interest came from. And then to start the podcast, I was really bored. Working at a school, we all had to work from home for actually it was over a year. And so I had a lot of free time on my hand. And I saw the book on my bookshelf, and I thought, I'm going to pick this back up. At that time, I didn't know the Paul Dale version was out. And so I stumbled upon that just from researching. And then I was like, okay, I really want to do this. I've always been a fan of like whananga, storytelling. When I lived in Tonga, that was one of like my, I was kind of a nerdy kid where all my friends were outside playing. And whananga would come on the radio, and I would be sitting at home listening to the stories, and not just like passive listening. I was actively listening because it was so fascinating. And all the stories, the whananga that I would hear, I would just imagine all these things, and really just ingrained in me just how rich, our stories are, and our legends, our histories, our culture. And so that's when I thought I should use this time maybe and share this with, especially with a generation that's unfamiliar with this work, with this body of work. So that's really what motivated me to do it. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that's great, Marlon, Richard. If there's anyone in the group that has any questions for Richard, please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask him directly. I've got plenty of questions, so I mean, I can.
I was going to say, no questions, what, we can end?
I'm just mindful of not taking up all of the airtime because there's plenty of people here who I'm sure are curious about the book and the podcast, but I'm happy to, you know what I really loved, Richard, was your ability to be able to take out, you know, a lot of, even though the book was detailed through Mariner's eyes, there were so many like beautiful cultural protocols that were unfolding throughout the story. And then I really liked that you brought in Lisiate Funaki, and Dr. Kaili makes an appearance too, and they help to unpack some of those protocols. So I love that but Kaili came in and explained like the origins of Si'ota Ofa, which I didn't know. So now I have a greater appreciation of that particular greeting, and I understand the importance of why. I love that even Kaili was like, I'm not sure why it was replaced with Malolele. And then I really liked as well when you brought Funaki on, you said Funaki, and he counters some of Mariner's observations, which I think is important because it helps to give a little bit more of a balanced perspective in terms of the writing. So like, and you know, the other thing too that I found interesting in terms of hearing your narration, Richard, was your highlighting of Ugalala's life and how the spotlight, and how there was a particular spotlight on him. Have you read his latest? There's an actual book on Whina Ugalala that I noticed that's online. Have you read that book?
No, I have not read that book, and I would love to get a hold of it because I think as the podcast progressed, and I talk about this in the podcast too, I really feel that he is the main character in this story. And I feel like there's just so much about him. So I'm very grateful that Mariner was there to actually witness, you know, his character and document his journey as you know, we know him as Whina Ugalala, one of the important chiefs in Tongan history, but there's just so many dimensions about him that we didn't know about. And at first, reading the book, I was like, oh, this guy is such a jerk. But then we learn that he's much more complicated than that, yeah? And so I'm recording the last episode right now because we are at the very end, and I'm kind of having separation anxiety because he just, you know, so plot, for those of you who are not keeping up with podcast, I'm going to spoil it for you. He passes away. We all eventually die. But in the last episode and towards the end of the book, there is, you know, he passes away, and really the heart of the story, it really just ends right there. It really just dies right there. And so I'm trying to make this last episode very exciting, because that is such a huge transition from such a magnificent central figure in this story. And then we have Mariner, of course, who's going to go home and write this book. But no, I did not know that. And I think I definitely, if you can send me the information on that book. And then there was just a lot of things. I had no idea I was related to him. And so, you know, one of my aunties mentioned that, you know how aunties are. They don't care about the podcast, but she was like, go ahead, Makoya. You know, so I'm trying to explain to her what a podcast is, but then she goes, but then she reveals that we have a blood connection to her, and actually sent me genealogy. And so that was really cool to see. And not just Ugalala, but also Toi Umu, the Vava'u chiefess. You know, we have a blood relation to her, and many of the characters, and I'm sure many of you do too. you know, so that's one of the things just about being Tongan, is that we're all interrelated in some way. So yeah, Ulukalala to me is the central figure of this story. He is so fascinating, and we learn so much about Tongan culture just through the interactions with, you know, if there was no Finau Ulukalala, this story wouldn't go anywhere, you know? And so just to have towards the end of, I don't know if he've ever had a redemption arc. You know how some stories, there's a redemption, and I don't think I would want him to, in the way that he passed. To me, I feel that's very human. And I appreciate that that experience was very raw for us to, you know, we got to see his brilliance. We got to see his barbaric, no, I don't want to use that word. That's very, his very Tongan ways. we'll just leave it at that. His very Tongan ways. And Anne, one more thing, I want to just go back to what you mentioned earlier. I wanted to bring more guests on to come and just, you know, elucidate on some of the things that we were talking about, but it really just became an issue of time. And so it was really hard to just coordinate and find people to come on, because really this, my podcast, when you're listening to my podcast compared to professional podcasts, mine is very it's very loose. Yeah, and if I had the time, and I think if I had the budget to allocate to even making it more, because it is such an epic story that deserves something than my little Whakamuna podcast, yeah? And I'm very happy that you all appreciate it and that we can gather around and talk about it. But like I said in the podcast, Ulukalala's story could be a Hollywood epic, you know, in the right hands. Let me put that in there. Because it's just the story is so awesome, and not just Ulukalala, but everything that happens along the way as mariners documenting it. So yeah, I just wish I had more time, and I totally agree with you, because I love the insights that they brought to the story. That's my only regret, you know, that. And I was gonna say the 1 year gap, but I don't regret that because I really needed that 1 year gap. But I apologize for that, and I'm glad you all came back. Emma at the end already. Yes, Emma.
Siatofa Lisiate.
Siatofa.
Sorry, I have to introduce myself. I'm president of the management committee for the Tongan language school here in Sydney. So our principal has visited Mana. So just want to say hi. My question is,
yes.
Forgive my ignorance. I'm more biased towards Hapai, so Ulukalala has not that interest. And I've just come across your podcast, so I will listen to it. Where is the time frame of Captain Cook with Ulukalala? Is this before or way before?
No, this is just like 30 years before.
So is this the same Ulukalala that they were waiting on to for the nod to kill Captain Cook, or if that's the story, that's the story?
You know what? Yeah, I believe that was the first Ulukalala, his father, but I could be wrong. But because that falls in line with the timeline. Yeah, good question. And we only know that from the podcast because Mariner references Captain Cook. And so some of his knowledge that they have of Tonga and of Ha'apai, because, you know, Cook spent a lot of his time in Ha'apai, right? And so some of the knowledge, so when Mariner came to Tonga on the Port-au-Prince, they already had some knowledge of Tonga because of Captain Cook.
Malo.
And thank you for your question. That sounded like I sounded like a pageant contestant. Thank you for the question.
Malo Lisiate. Oh, can I just jump in and?
Yeah, please go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So
Loa!
just a little short. First of all, just say good to see you, Lisiate. It's been years, and just listening to your podcast. It's been awesome. First of all, just a quick introduction for those of you who don't know me. My name is Loa Toito'o, or that's short for Ahotai Loa. I call myself an artist, visual artist, and I teach art at a local secondary school, high school. Been teaching for over 11 years now, still teaching in Auckland. As you see, my friends here, Ben and Saya, we all have similar interests, and like yourselves. I was born in Tonga, but I came when I was 4 years old, spent a little time in Australia, about 4 years. I almost lost my my Tongan language because English is used at home more, frequent. But being back home with more, with more family, it's I've learned to I don't know, refresh in my Tongan. But anyways, what I wanted to add is not more of a question, but just how amazing you express the stories of Ukalala in the Mariner book, because I've known the book for years, since the 90s as well. And I haven't really read the whole book, only in patches, because of the words and the names. It threw me off. But listening to your podcast, it just brought it to life, And I've been to Vava'u for just once, but I could imagine how you described it. And sometimes, when you get academics, I don't count myself as an academic, but when you get academics, sometimes they can also throw you off. But your language and the way you use it, and your own personality, it's awesome. I've been laughing, especially like the letters when Mariner showed Ukalala about the writing and stuff like that. But you brought it to life, and so yeah, thank you for that. And I hope there's a continuation with something, maybe Ukalala, because I think this keeps it rich and how I don't want to carry on too long, but yeah, that's my little input, Malo.
Yeah, thank you, Loa, for that. I love to tell a story. For anyone who knows me, sometimes I can talk way too long, but we have to contextualize these stories in a way that it makes sense to our not just our generation, but we have to consider where they grow up in, right? The cultures they live in. And I just know from our school, because our school is mostly Pacific Islanders, and these kids, there's always issues of cultural identity and things like that. And so I think we kind of do a disservice to them when we make them feel like they need to be authentically Tongan, right? Or they have to speak the language. And we have to consider that these are kids who, many of them are second or third, even fourth generation. And so their parents don't speak Tongan. And if their grandparents are still alive, Tongan is spoken at the home, but not as much. And so this is one of the things that we have to learn how to navigate, but then also to really help the young kids we work with be okay with the fact that you may not know everything in Tongan culture, but we don't expect you to. Otherwise, we should all just move back to Tonga, right? So that to me never made sense. And so it's helping our kids just reconcile all these things. Even I had to do that myself, because I left Tonga when I was very young, and my Tongan right now is, if people were to hear me, it's so bad. But I don't feel bad about it at all. I feel bad that I didn't do a better job of appreciating it, because then I think I would have been able to preserve it. But at the same time, I have to recognize all the things that were attacking my cultural identity daily, right? And so when you move to America and you are living in a very white, dominant cultural society, and so everything tells you that you don't matter here, and you have to fight for that space and for that place so that you can matter. And so unfortunately for many of us, that's one of the things that we usually lose first is language. But I'm also grateful that I still have people in my life who speak Tongan all the time. You know, I wish my mom would speak Tongan, um, but she doesn't. And she never spoke Tongan to us. And even when we lived in Tonga, you know, English was my first language. And it was not until we moved to Tonga that I learned how to speak Tongan. Because my mom's mother, oh, she did not like having Tongan kids who did not know how to speak the language. And so that was very important to her. And then that eventually became very important to me as well. And it's funny because when I'm around Tongans, the Tongan starts coming back. When I go to Tonga, oh my gosh, it's so crazy. I believe all that stuff is wired into your brain and it just needs to be activated, you know? So when I go to Tonga, the Tongan just comes back so quickly. And then when I come back to America, I can feel also that, you know, losing it starts to withdraw from you because I'm not around other Tongans. And I think even like speaking Tongan, you have to think like a Tongan, and that's something that we don't really think about. Thinking in Tongan is so different from, and so when I go to Tonga, I have to think like a Tongan. Otherwise, my relatives there would beat the hell out of me because they get so annoyed when I'm watching the clock. And I'm like, we need to be at this place at this time. This is the agenda. And they're all looking at you like, oh, you're crazy.
Siete Ofa, Lisiate. It's really an honor to have you in the space and to be able to talk with you. So I have like no knowledge whatsoever of any of these texts. Like I know maybe like 2 stories. Like I'm zero knowledge, nothing. So this might be a question with a really like obvious answer, but I'm just wondering, is there any mention in any of these stories that you've read of like Hafakasi or hybrid or like mixed identities?
Very good question. I think at this time in the book, we are starting to, so Tonga has already been introduced to Europe, right? And at this time in the book, there are a few mentions of like Palangis who came on other ships, and they were in Tonga before Mariner, and they actually had children with some of the local people. And were still living in Tonga when the time Mariner was there. And so, but very few. I don't think the Hafekasi phenomenon really became a thing until the mid 1800s. That was about the time when my German relatives came from Germany to Vava'u, you know, but at that time there was a big, like everyone was coming to the Pacific. And Tonga was just, you know, fighting off colonization and became the Kingdom of Tonga and a British protectorate. And so I think at the time of Mariner, that wasn't happening as much. And I don't know if you've been listening to the last couple of episodes, but an interesting story about a Palangi woman from America who ended up in Tonga and had kids with a chief Teukava. And she also arrived in Tonga similarly to the way Mariner did, where she was on a ship. They attacked the ship when it got to Tonga, and she and her African slave and a couple of other, some Hawaiians, and I think an Indonesian, they were the survivors of that particular incident. And she ended up living in Tonga and having kids with one of the important chiefs in Tonga, Teukava. And so other than that, I don't recall any other mentions in the book or even in some of the other stuff that I cross-referenced. But if any of you guys know, like, you know, I'm all about crowdsourcing. So this is you know, let's share. Sharing is caring. Yeah, and the interesting thing, I didn't know this, but my mother's from Fatai, and the Bloomfields, and any of you have heard the Bloomfield last name, but they also come from Fatai. And so so I didn't know that the Bloomfields are descendants of Elizabeth oh my gosh, I forgot her last name. But the woman I just talked about. So they're descendants of her relationship with the chief Teukawa. Mori, thank you. Thank you, Saya. And the Fangfangu that was beautiful. Way to set the stage.
Hey, can I just jump in? I just going off that half-caste question, because when you asked the question of half-caste, it made me think, you're probably, I wonder if you're just talking specifically about Palangi, half Tongan, half-caste, because it would make sense that there are other types of half-caste, like half Tongan, half Fijian, half Samoan, etc. And whether there are similar attitudes towards half-caste mixed Polynesian people, or not. I don't even know what my question is. I was just thinking out loud, like, yeah, there would have been half-caste Samoan, Fijian, whatever, but whether they're like,
Oh,
you're
yeah.
just a half Samoan, how am I going to fight any kind of thing?
Yeah, I definitely think, okay, let me backtrack, because I apologize when I hear Hafkasi, I always think of Palangis, and maybe that's very, very racist of me. So let's rewind and let's talk about that. Because in Tonga, you know, in Tongan culture, when we hear the word Hafkasi, we always think it's half Palangi, right? But I think what Josiah alluded to, and we see this in the book, is there were so many Tongan Samoan relationships, which should make sense to us if we are familiar with the Tu'itonga Empire, because the Tu'itonga, there were so many of them that were living in Samoa and marrying Samoans and having, you know, children with their Samoan wives. And so it's very, when you think about the history of Vava'u, and even just the Hingoa Fratentenekwe of Vava'u, you know, and I mentioned this in the last episode, Ha'afuluhau, which really talks about this relationship that was very special between Vava'u and Samoa. And so, and not just that, but if you remember in some of the ceremonies that we saw that happened under the watch of Finau Ulukalala, he wanted Samoan protocol for some of these rituals and these traditions that we normally had in Tonga. So when his daughter died, he did not want a Tongan funeral for her the way we understand Tongan funerals. He wanted a Samoan, it was a hybrid of what he wanted, and then also Samoan traditions. And then even if you go back several episodes towards the beginning where there was a marriage, I believe it was Moingangongo when he got married, and he came to Vava'u, or he came to Ha'apai, I think it was Ha'apai. He came back from Samoa and he had 2 Samoan wives, but then he married 2 other young women that were already betrothed to him. And so during that ceremony, he also incorporated a lot of Samoan elements into that marriage. And so I think that was always happening, and that was very normalized back then. And the interesting thing in the book I noticed is that there's no, you know, Mariner's there, and yes, of course, he's a little kid, but there's no Palangi worship whatsoever of Palangis that are coming to Tonga. So that's one thing I noticed, because they slaughtered them when they came to Tonga. And these Tongans were fearless. They did not fear them at all. Okay, so they would come to Tonga, and of course they would befriend them, but then they're already plotting something, as in the, you know, what happened with the Port-au-Prince. And they completely slaughtered everyone on that ship except for Mariner and some of the Hawaiians. And there was a few Palangis on there. Okay, but like slaughter because Tongans are racist. No, Tongans then knew what was up. They knew what was up. Okay. And really it was because they wanted the resource. They wanted the iron, and Tonga does not have iron. But I mean, I think that's something that we need to really think about. When did that start happening? Is this worship of light skin, you know, European features? Did it start around this time? Did Christianity kind of just like amplified that? I really think it does. That's just my own opinion. I'll have to go back and research that. But I think, you know, in the 1800s, and Mariner's time ends around 1810, I believe. But you have this whole other century, the rest of the century, where European presence in Tonga was so heavy, and Christianity specifically, and especially thinking about the way Christianity was so integral to the formation of the modern Tongan government that we know of today, right? That all happened right after Ulukalala's time.
Can I just ask a question? More of an observation. You mentioned there was no worship of the Balangis.
Yes.
Just curious, where did that Balangi word come from? Or is it more missionary that the Balangi, they refer to them as gods, or maybe allude to that fact?
Yeah, that's interesting, Hema, because I do think about that a lot, and I've actually been to some Tongan, it's called Tongan Research Association now, but I've been to some of their conferences where they have, that discussion. I really think, and I believe, Alisi, good question. I don't recall. If somebody could please, I do not have a good memory, okay? If someone could please, if you can add to that, Alisi asked, was the word Balangi used in Mariner's book? I don't recall seeing the word Balangi. And Hema asked a very good question, because we were told that Balangi means literally a translation, they burst from the sky. I think of it as and I heard this being discussed in these conferences, that it's really more of a term that came out of our understanding of the way the curvature of the world, and if you're thinking about navigation, and when things are appearing at a distance, right, over the horizon, and if you really envision the sky and what that looks like, and here are all these boats, huge types, these types of boats Tongans have never seen before, even though we have our own history of magnificent, large canoes that are way more, in some ways, technically superior than some of these European ships. But imagine never seeing, melanemic people for the first time. That's what I'm going to call them. And seeing them for the first time, and they're coming from far away in the horizon. To me, it would make sense that that's how you would describe them. People who came from far away from the horizon. Yes, they came from wherever the sun or the sun is rising or setting. To me, that makes more sense than people who burst from the sky. Because think about Tongans and the way the ancient Tongan religion was. Okay, you have Hikuleo, who was at the time the most important godhead in the Tongan pantheon of gods. And so if we're going to have this long tradition of worshiping the Tongan gods and having people in Tonga representing them, as their, oh my gosh, forgot the name for the Tongan priest. But they all had representatives. It was very important in Tongan culture at that time. And so before, if I forgot, is it Tohunga? Can someone help me with that? I can't remember. Alisi, do you know? Taula, thank you. Setuata, if I forgot, I think those are all Christian. Those all came after Christianity. But Taula, every god had some kind of a god house, is what they call it, or a temple. And they had a priest or priestess who would reside over these places and speak for the gods. So I think one of the fascinating things about the book is that we actually had our own belief system. Okay, I think one of the things that we are taught in this post-colonial life is that we really had nothing. We had nothing. Or we believe, we worship animals or whatever. But we actually had a very sophisticated belief system. And I mean, when I say sophisticated, it is so layered. It is so layered. and so many rituals associated with it. And some of them were not so great. I'm not going to judge. But the notion that we have nothing and that Christianity came to fill this void because we were a bunch of heathens is completely wrong. And so I think that's something that I really learned in this book. And so, you know, we may look at some of the things that happened back then, like infanticide, right? Horrific. Sacrificing children so that you're trying to revive someone who's dying or someone who died, you know, and of course that's very horrific. And that's just the way they did things at that time. But then I can also say, look at the horrific things that were committed at that time in the name of Christianity, right? Colonization was happening. Think of the genocide. I mean, where I live here in North America, they are still finding mass graves of Native children, you know, and this all happened around that time. And so I think when we are looking at our own belief system in the past and we're trying to cast judgments using, you know, what we know of the world today and how we worship today, we have to consider everything, consider all the pieces when you are trying to, you know, evaluate what spirituality and what religion was like in Tonga at that time.
There's 3 questions, Lisiate, in the chat. I don't know if you've seen them, but just, yeah, I think that's it. Was the word Palangi used in Mariner's book? Did you find out what Moinga? There's a couple others.
Moinga Ngongo. I did not, Loa, but if you care to know, please share. Because in the book, and I mentioned this in the podcast, Mariner does not use that word. He only mentions it once. Okay, and then he makes some reference in the parentheses saying that it's a name that he doesn't like to. It's uncouth, is what he said. So that shout out to Melanie Mixisu. So I don't know what the whole thing is, and Law, if you know, please share unless you know if it crosses the boundaries of Whakaapa, then maybe we shouldn't.
Could I just add, you said Moinga in Samoan, Moinga is Mohenga, beard, Moinga. Is that right?
That's what yeah, I did some research on that, but it could mean other things too. That was just the first thing that pulled up.
Oh,
What
cool,
else
because
does
the
it mean?
ngongo, ngongo, I think is a bird. Is that ngongo kilitoto? It's that frigate bird, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and that I knew, ngongo or nono, but yeah. So I don't know why Mariner mentioned that. Maybe we need to bring in some Samoans and they can add more context to that. But yeah, I felt that was very interesting. And so he only mentions that once in like chapter 5, but then in the last part of the book where Moingangongo actually, you know, becomes the next chief of. Oh, I heard somebody.
I have a 2-part question, Lisiate. So I'm just wondering, when you were going through the book, if you had any reservations around like this being told from a you know, Palangi's perspective lens, and when you were reading through the book, and I'm sorry I haven't read the whole book, but if you had because we mentioned before like thinking like a Tongan, did you catch that when like that Mariner was, you know, I know he was fluent in the language and he became fluent, but did it sound like also he was starting to, you know, have that mindset of thinking like a Tongan? Like it's one thing to talk, like learn the language and speak the language, but another way to like actually have the mindset of a Tongan. So that's my first part of my question. The other part is, did you, were you able to come across the book in the Tongan translation? I know that there was a Tongan translation of the book. I'm curious to know if your thoughts around that, if like how it's being translated from English to Tongan of, Mariner's account to the Tongan language. I'm just going to drop the link of where I saw this, of the Tongan translation of the book, that it was presented to, I believe it was Princess Angelica Latu Fuipeka Tukuaho, who's Tonga's High Commissioner to Australia. But it was translated by Nigel Statham, who is a translator of Polynesian languages, and his wife is Tongan, Melanaite, who helped with the translation. So I'm curious if you knew anything about that part, about the Tongan translation, and your thoughts around, like, the English being like translated, how that could make a shift in how things are perceived.
Yeah.
So sorry, I'm going to drop the link, but sorry if my questions are kind of.
No, please do, because I definitely want to look that up. I think that would be very interesting to read. So let me go back to your first question. One thing we need to consider is that Mariner did not write his account right when he got back to England. It happened way, way in his late years. And so there is a big gap. And so that's one of the things that we also need to be careful about in taking his account as a matter of fact, right? As a recorded factual documentation of what Tonga was like back then. Because I can just tell from some of the things that he's trying to describe is that there has been such a huge lapse in time that he's getting some details wrong about certain Tongan ceremonies and rituals and like relationships between kin and things like that. And so Paul Dale actually corrects that in his book, and he calls that out. I don't think Mariner, I believe if he wrote this book right when he got back to England, this book would definitely have a more Tongan perspective. Yeah, because it's still fresh in his mind. But if you read the book as it is so judgmental AF. You can tell that he records and he reports on these events, but there's a little tinge of judgment there about certain things that he saw. And he actually even just like, he's definitely not a non-biased recorder of what he's witnessing. And he's definitely inserting some of his thoughts and feelings and commentary, and so I just think that's something we need to also be mindful of. And I'm also mindful of that as well. What I appreciate about his account is that there was really nobody else in Tonga that was documenting the way he was, right? And he was actually very privileged in the things that he was allowed to see. And so I think that's important for us to also to recognize. But at the same time, we always have to be suspicious of these kinds of accounts and always cross-checking. And that's why I just do a lot of cross-referencing for the episodes, because I have to verify, some things that he mentions, and even some of the place names that he mentions are wrong. And so I would have to look into that just a little deeper to make sure that, oh, did I read that correctly? And I think, if you're familiar with just the history of, colonization and the way things have been documented and reported on us, on Pacific Islanders in general, you should always be cast suspicions wide and just I don't trust anyone at all, so I always have to double check everything, and not even Mariner.
I think, Paulina, you had a question. Did you want to ask that directly, sis, or do you want me just to read it for you?
Hi, how's it going, Lisiate? So happy to have you here.
Hello.
I'm so sorry I'm late. I wanted to ask you, does anybody know of how accessible this book is in Tonga? Like, I feel like my copy did come from Tonga, but I'm reading like in the hands of the public community, because I'm noticing like certain authors that we value here in the diaspora are not authors that a lot of people in the region, such as Tonga, I'm not sure if it's due to accessibility or if it's just like they're not interested. And so I'm just wondering what, if anybody knows or has an idea of what the general perception of this account of Mariner's experience, or do people even read it because it's in English translation? The only, aside from yourself, Lisiate, the only person I have read that has researched, not even the whole thing, but a portion of it, is Lisiate Wolfgramm. And so it's extremely interesting to see like where people from the diaspora come from in interpreting this book. And I'm just wondering if anybody within the region itself has like thoughts.
Yeah, so I bought my book in Tonga, and this is when Vava'u Press still had a store in downtown in Tonga Tapu before the rioters burned it all down. And from what I understand, Vava'u Press was the company that printed the books, and there was a limited run of the first books. Yeah, and so after that, they didn't print anymore. And so it became like this rare item. And I'm actually really surprised, and I don't know who's printing the latest editions that are on Amazon. I don't know who's making money off of that. But I don't think it's Vava'u Press. But I do know, Pauline, when the first editions came out, it only came out in Tonga. And it did come out in English. I don't know who the audience was, but I just know from growing up that people were familiar with Mariner in Vava'u for sure. And because a lot of the events that he describes in the book, all those historical events happened in villages. And so those people are still kind of connected to some of those events that has, defined Vava'u and what it is today. I actually just remembered something I saw as a kid. They were building so when we lived in Vava'u, they were building a bank in downtown Neafu. And as they were excavating the land, they stumbled upon a pile of human bones. And I'm not talking about like when I eat chicken wings and I stack up my bones. I am talking about piles like high of human bones that just looked like they just threw them all in a pit and just buried them. And it was the coolest thing I remember seeing as a kid, although everyone was freaking out, but I was like, oh, that's really cool. And the chatter at the time, and even just hearing my parents, and everyone in Vava'u was talking about this finding, is that it was all connected to that time. So I don't know how accurate that is, but if we think about all the events that took place in Neafu, I wouldn't be surprised if all of that connected to the time of Mariner and Ulukala'a. But I know definitely for sure, and this isn't just Vava'u bias, but I'm just telling you, just from my experience in living there, that people there are familiar with the setting, but not so much the book itself. I actually don't think the book was written for Tongans. This is Mariner's account for a Palangi audience, and so thank you for that question, because that's a thing we also need to consider as well. And there's a certain kind of privilege there as well about access, right? And who has access to it. I didn't go to high school in Tonga, so I don't know if it's a part of their curriculum. So if any of you who did, if you can add to that, that would be great.
I know Benjamin's got a question, and Alicia's just added some additional context in the chat session. Can I just do a time check, Richard? Because I'm mindful that our Zoom sessions, the actual Zoom Talanoa is usually for an hour, and we do have an after hours component, but we want to be respectful of our guest speakers and those who have joined specifically for this part. Are you okay for time, Richard? And if you're okay to just accept a few more questions?
Yeah, I have nowhere to go tonight.
Marlon. Okay, over to you, Benjamin.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Oh, cool. Oh, siata ofa cousin. Siata ofa
Hey!
everyone. My name is Benjamin Work, and yeah, just thank you for this platform, this time and space to share in Talanoa. So I guess this is the after party. Is this the after
Oh,
after hours?
let's break out the liquor.
Yeah, this is Naughty Rubies online. So I just have two questions, just in regards to Koloa and Tuitonga and Ha'afuhau. And do you know any particular reason why Koloa Island was chosen by the Tuitonga for one of his residences? That was one question. And I see that all of Vava'u, but also Tuaniki Vale, Holeva, they all have these founding Samoan women in their stories, Apakula and others. And then also my second question is, are you familiar with the mariners in Samoa and that connection? And there's stories about William Mariner's son coming back to the islands following where his father went.
Yes. And actually some of them have reached out to me. So let me go back to your first question. You know, I mean, I'm not really sure, but just thinking about the legends that we have associated with Koloa. And so Koloa in some of our Tongan folklore is one of the places where Maui Atalanga lived when he came to to the mortal realm. And so that's one of the first places where he established a home. And so I would suspect, Benjamin, that's the reason why that specific area was chosen as a settlement for some of the early Tuitonga. Yeah, it was just because of that historical significance. I would really love to look more deeply into the relationships between that area and even just Vava'u as a whole with Samoa. Geographically, it makes sense because it's closer to Samoa, but there are just so many things that we are uncovering or that we've known about, but we just don't dig deeper into about our specific relationships that we have with Samoa, right? And Samoans and this whole thing about Ha'afuluhau and Sa'afulusau and just all of the many words that we share in common. And so that's just my theory on it. And I mean, if anyone wants to shoot me down, go for it, because it's really not based on anything but just my own knowledge. And I mean, this is one of those times I wish I talked to my grandfather about these kind of things, and I mean, if there's anything I regret, it's that I did not do that. He would know. But there was a god house in Koloa that was dedicated to Maui, and it's no longer there. It's from what I heard, some people came and dug up all the vegetation in the area, and so and in the process damaged where that site was used to be. And so I want to just use this opportunity also to talk about just how a lot of the things, a lot of our langis and a lot of our I didn't recall seeing a lot of langis in Vava'u, except for the ones, Ben, that you took pictures of. But all of these important relics that are part of our Tongan history is not, it's not preserved at all. And there's really no effort to turn them into some kind of a national park or some way where they are taken care of. So that's one of the saddest things about when I go back to Tonga and I go visit the Ha'amonga and seeing that someone is, tied their cow to it. Or, goats are like taking a crap nearby. And then there's graffiti all over it, and then seeing tourists climbing all over it, and then you're like chastising them and telling them, get the hell off the Ha'amonga, but then you see our own people running up and climbing on the hamon, you know? So the respect for all of those landmarks, there's just isn't any, and it's so sad. That saddens me when I go and I see that. And so I don't know what we need to do in this day and age and with this generation to Met Gala, yeah, to preserve, you know, to even help Tongans. And maybe this goes back to your question, Pauline, about what's important to Tongans, you know, and are these things important to Tongans? They seem more important to us. But when you are living there, and I think you're so occupied with other things and just trying to, you know, survive from day to day, those are not your priorities. And so, yeah, so thank you, Ben, for that. And then, so your second question, I've had some people from the Mariner family reach out to me. I knew there was a Samoan Mariner family, right? From the singers, there's some famous Samoan singers with the last name Mariner. But I didn't know that it was connected. And so it wasn't until this podcast, and then when I was doing my research for one of the episodes, one of the descendants emailed me and said she wrote a whole paper on it and sent me her research paper. Oh, which reminds me, I need to upload that in the folder. But she actually did a research paper on this, and I believe a documentary that they were filming before the pandemic. And so I know there's a documentary coming out, but Mariner's son came to Tonga. Okay, so this is the story. He came to Tonga and actually fell in love with a chief's daughter that was already promised to marry another chief. And so they had to take off from Tonga and go live in Samoa. So that's their whole story of how the Mariners in Samoa came about. So he ran off with this Tongan chief's daughter, and they went to Samoa and lived the rest of their lives there, and all their children married Samoans. And so that's where the Mariners in Samoa come from. So that's pretty fascinating. I didn't even know about that until the podcast. Kind of like how I didn't know about Elizabeth Maury. That story is crazy. My nieces, yeah.
Amazing. Richard, I just wanted to, if the group will allow me to, one of my favorite, I just want to indulge you all just with this particular part in the book that I really, really loved. And I think it's quite pertinent, particularly at this time where, you know, there's so much discussion around like capitalism, colonialism. And this was like one of my favorite things in all of the book was an exchange between Mariner and Ukalala. And I'll just read, if you let me, I'll read just the snippet so that way you can appreciate it yourselves. And so it's basically a discussion between Mariner and Finau. So Finau's, I think Mariner's trying to explain the value of money to him. And so this is Finau's response. If money were made of iron and could be converted into knives, axes and chisels, there would be some sense in placing a value on it. But as it is, I see none. If a man has more yams than he wants, let him exchange some of them away for pork. Certainly money is much more handier and more convenient, but then, as it will not spoil by being kept, people will store it up instead of sharing it out as a chief ought to do, and thus become selfish. I understand now very well what it makes the Palangi man, so actually he's written here, Papalangi man, so selfish, it is money. And I love that because I was like, oh, see, he already understands capitalism. He understands how evil capitalism is. That was one of my favorite things was their exchange between each other and Ukalala saying, oh, you know that. And also too, does that highlight that he's obviously had previous exchanges with Europeans for him to form that opinion?
Right. And what a brilliant observer. Yeah, because he's had these experiences with Europeans, but only sees what he wants from them. And obviously money and this whole construct of money was not important to him because of the way, they value it, which is completely different from how we value these types of, I don't want to say currency, but these types of exchanges that we were practicing at the time. And we still see that as a large part of our culture today. When we are exchanging our koloa and we are reciprocating by returning, other koloa. And so, and it keeps circulating within our communities and within our people. Yeah, and so I really love that insight, and that really just showed to me how brilliant Urukalala was, and that he wasn't fazed by these palangis and their fancy trinkets, and he knew capitalism was BS, right? He called that out from the late 17 to the early 1800s. He knew capitalism was BS. And so that's one of the things that I really love about, these little flashes of brilliance that we see from him. Calculating, right? He's always calculating and always trying to one up and just stay ahead of everyone. And so just one of the reasons why I really love him as a character, as a human being, really made him more real than just this, representation of someone who, took in this Palangi kid. And then, you contrast that with his other moments of like where he gives into his anger and drowns his adversaries in canoes with holes in it, right? And you see those two opposite things, but I can see the human in him. And I think that's important for us to realize, is that, what we're seeing as a human being. I don't want to give the impression that I'm worshiping this guy, because I'm not. I see all his flaws. I see all the great things about him, but also the bad things about him, which is really a reflection of all of us. We all have our good and our bad, and we live from day to day. And yeah, but thank you for bringing up that point, because that's one of my favorite parts and really kind of changes my whole perspective on Urukalala. I was like, oh, this guy, he's a badass. And then let me just add to that while someone is preparing a question for me. His take on religion was so interesting, because I did not for 1 minute think he was a believer at all. And I feel like throughout the whole book, he did a good job of hiding that. But towards the end, you could just tell that he was so done with the religion of that time. Yeah. And even just like tributes and things like that were starting to get less and less more important to him, following the protocols, when they were trying to go from different god houses and trying to appease the gods. He just was not, he was kind of halfway in, but you could kind of tell his foot wasn't in all the way as far as a believer in the ancient Tongan religion. And then even towards the end, it is revealed that he had plotted to kill some of the taula that weren't following his directions. And I think where you get to that point where you are not afraid to kill the taula of a god house, you are completely gone. And at that, I guess you could say he's an atheist by that time. And they all, in the book, they all say that's why he died, because he stopped believing. $100. Yeah.
I have a question. Thank you so much, Lisiate.
Lisi, I miss you.
I need to come hang out with y'all in Utah. Your podcast came at a time where I love podcasts, but I was so hungry to just hear our own voices, the cadence of our language, even just like jokes told in our own languages. And all of those things came through your podcast. So I just want to say thank you for bringing that kind of life to that area. And I know that so many other people are starting to listen to this kind of content because of what you did. So thank you for that. My question is, so many of the names, for example, Ulukalala, are names that I grew up in Tonga. I went to school primary, started high school there before coming here. Are names that you like memorize in school growing up when you have to learn Tongan history and the king lineages and all of that. And all of these things, are part of your story in your mind until I listened to your podcast and felt like the difference between what you did was like give flesh to these names in the way that you conveyed the story in your podcast. Sometimes I have to like grab a book and start taking notes because there were so many different people that I felt were so important in the story you were telling that felt like people. And I think that's, you had mentioned that before. So some of these names came to life for me because of the way that you were telling the story. And there's a part of me that's like, you were creative enough in your mind to produce a podcast about this. There's gotta be some other things that you're building that you can like leave behind for this generation. But I'm just wondering, like, has this inspired you to think about like maybe writing a book or maybe writing what do you call those things that become movies, that thing, or
a screenplay?
Screenplay, or
Yeah.
has this inspired other kinds of creative means of like bringing our stories to life?
Yeah, thank you so much, Alice, for your comments, and I appreciate that. I have really, if I were to redo this, it would definitely not be, I appreciate Mariner's perspective, but it would definitely be a story about Fina Ulukalala. Because he really is the central figure in this story. And I think a movie about him would be so fascinating because I really put him up there. I don't hero worship, but a lot of movies have been made about, certain figures in history. I don't see why he's not up there. Very intriguing character, HBO, totally. HBO or Netflix. I just think it would be such an interesting story. I watch a lot of Chinese movies, okay? So that's what I was raised on. When we lived in Vava'u, every Friday, we would go downtown and watch a Kung Fu flick. And then afterwards, we would come outside and go to Po'ono on the actual field of Po'ono and just beat the hell out of each other. That was our Friday thing. But I love Chinese cinema and just like cinematography. And so like, if you guys went and saw Shang-Chi, like Disney has nothing on Chinese cinema. So go and watch a lot of like Zhang Yimou movies. Even like one of my favorite Japanese directors, Akira Kurosawa, like watch those movies because they tell epic stories that unfold like some of our Tongan stories, and so there's a lot of similarities between our stories and their stories and relationships between people. And that's the thing I'm really interested in. I don't really care for violence and things like that. I really care about relationships and how those relationships come together, how they fall apart, the results from it, the aftermath. And in this book, we see those entanglements all the time. And we see Mariner conflicted with some of the things that he is participating in, and going back to Mariner, and then I'll come back to finish answering this question. And this is why I say he's judgmental, because he participates in these acts of violence, but then he comes back later in another chapter and he apologizes for it. And I'm like, dude, shut up. You already did it, okay? You already helped, you loaded the guns and you showed them how to do it. And so you see this as a pattern throughout the book. But anyway, so yeah, I definitely think Fina Ukalala's character would be so interesting to explore. I don't know what I would do with that, but I mean, I'm not ruling out going back to school, going to film school. That's something I've always thought about. I do have some experience in filmmaking and things like that, but just not in screenwriting. I don't know, but I think we have stories that can be told on the big screen. but also at the same time, I don't want us to feel that our stories are only legitimate if they are told on the big screen, right? We are very capable of telling our stories the way we want to tell them, whether it's on the big screen, whether it's in a little Whakamuna podcast like mine, or one that's very, you know, slick and like has high production values. The thing I love about today is that we have these democratizing platforms where we can actually just jump on and tell these things without having to be gatekept. And so, you know, having this discussion that we're having right now, or I could just go on my IG story and just, you know, BS for 2 hours about something that I want to talk about. But we have that capability today, whereas before we didn't. You know, when I was going to college, none of this stuff existed. Facebook, I remember, was just coming out, and my professors, you know, this is when only certain universities had it. And my professors at the time were like, oh, Facebook is not going to go anywhere. Oh gosh, they are eating their words now. Yeah. And so that's the time I was in college, right? And I was really, filmmaking is just one of those things I always had back in my mind. So if I ever take this another level, that's probably where I would take it. But my hope is that people who listen to this podcast, that they're inspired to do their own thing, right? And so I hope they use that as a springboard, because we have so many stories we can tell. Mariner's story is not the only story. And I don't want us to think that, you know, his story is the only legit story. There are so many stories that we can create from our cultures, whether it's a, you know, a reiteration of a legend or an original story. I love ghost stories. I want to tell a ghost story. You know, so I mean, and we have so many fascinating stories about spirits and things like that. I personally don't think spirits are evil. I have my own experiences when I was a child with spirits, and it was not an evil experience that I came away from thinking, oh, I need to be scared of this, you know? And so for me, I think that's something that's beautiful and that I would like to explore, because I think spirits are misunderstood people who need to leave, and we need to help them. We need to help them transition to that where they're supposed to be. So yeah, that's sorry for the long answer.
Lisiate?
Richard.
Sorry.
Sorry, but just quickly, because I'm mindful too of the time. We will, I think, because we've also been recording, so if we can still continue the questions afterwards if there are people that want to hang around and stay on, and if Richard, of course, is happy to stay on. But I think we'll take this opportunity now, Lilika, to stop recording. Is that all right, Lilika? So that way the formal part of this Talanoa is captured, but we're more than welcome to keep going for, and if there are people that are time conscious that need to go, please, we're happy for you to leave, or you're welcome to stay on, up to you. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
Lisiate, was there a maternal figure for Mariner? I just remember reading maybe there was a letter that was sent to him.
Yes, thank you for that question. Mafihape is her name, and this, I believe, was the fourth wife of Finau Ulukalala. And she didn't have any children, and so that's why Finau Ulukalala gave Mariner to her to raise, because I think he was, if you guys can help me remember, I think he was 12 at the time when he arrived in Tonga. And so Mafihape was the one that got to raise him. And in the next episode, in the last episode, I actually talk about this letter, because you guys, there is this letter she wrote to him, and the letter is preserved, okay? And it's sitting somewhere in, I believe it's a document that's in a museum somewhere. But there is a picture of it, and I'm gonna share it, because when you read the letter, and I'm getting emotional here, but when you read the letter, you really read it in the voice of a Tongan mother. And it's kind of sad, you know? So she gives an update of her life and what it's been like since he left England. And And that after Finau Ulukalala died, she basically was relegated to a nothing status. And she was forced to move back to Hawaii to go and live the rest of her life in Hawaii because her husband was deceased and he was no longer the chief, right? And so that was, from what I understand, and this reminds me of just so many of the Chinese movies I watch where the setting is the imperial palace and there are fights in between wives and concubines, right? And so if you cross the head wife or the top wife, then you are moved to like some shack outside of the central palace, you know, those kind of dynamics. And it sounded like to me that when Finau Ulukalala passed away and Moengango became the next chief, he then brought in all his wives, and of course they took over. I don't want to say royal residence, but you know, they were the people in charge, which means that Finau Ulukalala's wives would then either be displaced or they just won't be significant anymore. And so from what I understand, she actually requested to go to Hawaii, to go to her family in Hawaii because of the way that she was treated, basically. But anyway, she writes a letter to Mariner. And if you guys read it, it's in, you know, she writes it in Tongan. And the way you read it from top to bottom, it's in totally the voice of a Tongan mother. And it's very sad, just hearing what happened to her life afterwards. But to even think that she cherished this relationship that she had with Mariner after, you know, he left England. Yeah, just thank you for that question, because I think that's very important to also consider, is that Mariner had people who were actually taking care of him. And his relationship with Mafi Hape was very special. I believe the letter's in the Google folder. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with that, there is a link in, if you just go to the IG page for the podcast, there's a link in there to a Google folder that's just got a whole bunch of stuff I have uploaded in there that I used to research for the podcast, and Mafi Hape's letters in there.